There are moments in history when a single object, seemingly innocent, holds within it a story so profound that it changes everything we thought we knew. A photograph, a letter, a fragile piece of paper preserved across more than a century, these are not just relics of the past. They are windows into lives lived in silence, into truths buried beneath layers of time and forgetting. What you are about to hear is one such story. It begins with a letter dated 1903, carefully folded, its edges yellowed with age, its handwriting elegant and deliberate. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than a routine correspondence, a polite exchange between two people separated by distance. The words are measured, the tone formal, the sentiments seemingly ordinary. But if you look closer, if you let your eyes wander not just across the surface of the words but between them, around them, beneath them, you will see something that was never meant to be seen. You will see a hidden line, a trace of something darker, something that transforms this peaceful letter into a document of profound historical significance. Where are you calling from? I want to know. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The letter was discovered in an estate sale in rural Virginia in the early 2000s. It was tucked inside a leather-bound journal, itself part of a larger collection of family papers that had been stored in an attic for generations. The family selling the items had little knowledge of their contents. They were simply clearing out the home of a distant relative who had passed away without heirs. Among the dusty boxes and forgotten belongings, this letter seemed unremarkable. It was addressed to a woman named Margaret, written in the hand of someone named Thomas, and dated April 14, 1903. The paper was fragile but intact, the ink still legible despite the passage of more than 100 years. A historian specializing in early 20th century American correspondence happened to attend the sale. She purchased the journal and its contents on a whim, drawn by the quality of the handwriting and the age of the materials. Back in her study, she began to examine the letter more closely. The words themselves were polite, even affectionate. Thomas wrote to Margaret about the weather, about his work, about mutual acquaintances. He inquired after her health and expressed his hope that they would see each other soon. Nothing in the text itself suggested anything unusual. But as the historian held the letter up to the light, preparing to photograph it for her archive, she noticed something strange. There was a faint shadow running parallel to one of the lines of text, a subtle discoloration that didn't quite match the rest of the paper. At first, she thought it might be a stain, perhaps caused by water damage or the passage of time. But the shadow was too precise, too deliberate. It followed the contour of the words with an intentionality that suggested human intervention. She placed the letter under a magnifying glass and adjusted the angle of the light. What she saw made her breath catch. Between the lines of visible text, written in a much lighter ink, almost invisible to the naked eye, was another layer of writing. The words were cramped, hurried, and written in a different hand. They were squeezed into the spaces between the formal sentences, hidden in the margins, tucked beneath the fold of the paper. This was not a simple letter. This was a document containing two voices, two narratives, two realities existing side by side. The first voice was Thomas, writing openly, his words meant to be read by anyone who might intercept the letter. The second voice was Margaret, writing in secret, her words meant only for Thomas, hidden from the prying eyes of those who controlled her life. The discovery was staggering. The historian immediately understood that she was holding something extraordinary, a piece of evidence that spoke to the lived experience of women in the early 1900s, to the ways in which communication had to be concealed, to the strategies employed by those who had no freedom to speak openly. But the full significance of the letter would only become clear as she began to decode the hidden text, word by painstaking word. The process was slow and meticulous. The historian used a combination of ultraviolet light, high-resolution photography, and digital enhancement to reveal the hidden writing. She worked late into the night, her eyes strained, her hands steady as she transcribed each fragile word. What emerged was a narrative of fear, of control, of a woman trapped in a situation from which she could see no escape. Margaret's hidden words told a story that the surface text could never convey. She wrote of being watched constantly, of having her correspondence read and scrutinized, of being forbidden to leave the house without permission. She described a household ruled by a man she referred to only as him, a figure whose presence loomed over every aspect of her existence. She wrote of small acts of defiance, a book hidden beneath her mattress, a conversation whispered in the garden, a letter smuggled out in the lining of a coat. And she wrote of her desperate hope that Thomas, wherever he was, would understand the coded messages she was sending him and would somehow find a way to help her. The tone of Margaret's hidden writing was starkly different from the polite formality of Thomas's visible text. Her words were raw, urgent, filled with a quiet desperation that was all the more powerful for being so carefully concealed. She did not describe physical violence in explicit terms, but the implications were clear. She wrote of bruises that could not be explained, of nights spent locked in her room, of meals withheld as punishment. She wrote of the constant threat of being sent away, of being declared unfit, of having her voice silenced permanently. And she wrote of her fear that if anyone discovered her hidden messages, the consequences would be unthinkable. As the historian pieced together the fragments of Margaret's narrative, she began to research the identities of the people involved. Thomas, it turned out, was Margaret's cousin, a man who had moved to the West Coast in search of work and who maintained a sporadic correspondence with his family back east. Margaret was the daughter of a wealthy landowner, a man known in the community for his piety and his strict adherence to traditional values. On the surface, the family appeared respectable, even admirable. But behind closed doors, a different reality existed. The historian found records of Margaret's father in local archives, property deeds, business transactions, church records. She found mentions of Margaret herself in society columns, brief notices of her attendance at social events, descriptions of her as quiet, reserved, dutiful. But there was no mention of the life she described in her hidden writing. There was no record of her suffering, no acknowledgement of the control exerted over her every movement. It was as if the woman who wrote those secret words did not exist in any official capacity. She was a ghost, her voice erased from the historical record, her story known only to herself and to Thomas, the one person she trusted enough to confide in. The historian realized that this letter was not just a personal artifact. It was a historical document of immense value, a rare glimpse into the hidden lives of women who were denied agency, autonomy, and the right to speak freely. It was evidence of a system of control that was pervasive in the early 1900s, a system that relied on silence, on the suppression of women's voices, on the erasure of their experiences from public view. She began to write an article detailing her findings, carefully contextualizing the letter within the broader history of gender, power, and communication in early 20th century America. She reached out to other historians, to archivists, to scholars of women's history, seeking their input and their expertise. The response was overwhelming. The letter became the subject of academic conferences, of public exhibitions, of documentary films. It was reproduced in textbooks, analyzed in classrooms, discussed in forums and online communities. Margaret's hidden words, once meant only for Thomas, were now being read by thousands of people, her story finally being heard more than a century after she had written it. But as the letter gained recognition, questions began to arise. Who was Margaret really? What had happened to her after 1903? Had Thomas received her hidden messages? Had he tried to help her? And what had become of the man she referred to only as him, the figure who had controlled her so completely? The historian returned to the archives, determined to find answers. She searched through census records, marriage certificates, death notices, property transfers. She combed through newspaper archives, looking for any mention of Margaret or her family. And slowly, painfully, she began to piece together the rest of Margaret's story. Margaret had been born in 1881, the only daughter of a man named Elias Hargrove, a landowner and merchant who had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd business dealings and inherited wealth. Her mother had died when Margaret was young, and she had been raised by a succession of governesses and housekeepers, women who were themselves subject to Elias's strict control. Margaret had been educated at home, taught to read and write, to play the piano, to embroider, to conduct herself with the grace and decorum expected of a young woman of her class. But she had also been taught to obey without question, to suppress her own desires, to accept her father's authority as absolute. By the time she reached adulthood, Margaret was effectively a prisoner in her own home. She was not allowed to leave the property without an escort. She was not permitted to correspond freely with friends or relatives. Her every movement was monitored, her every word scrutinized. Elias justified this control by claiming that he was protecting her, that the world outside was dangerous, that she was too delicate, too innocent to navigate it on her own. But those who knew the family understood the truth. Elias was not protecting Margaret. He was controlling her, isolating her, ensuring that she remained dependent on him and that she would never be able to challenge his authority. The letter dated April 14, 1903, was written during a particularly difficult period in Margaret's life. Elias had begun to pressure her to marry a man of his choosing, a business associate who was twice her age and whose reputation in the community was far from spotless. Margaret had resisted, quietly but firmly, and Elias had responded by tightening his control even further. She was forbidden to leave her room except for meals. She was not allowed to receive visitors. Her correspondence was read and censored. It was during this time that she began to write her hidden messages to Thomas, using a technique she had learned from a novel she had read years earlier, a story about spies and secret codes and clandestine communication. Thomas, for his part, had understood the hidden messages immediately. He had grown up in the same household as Margaret, had witnessed firsthand the ways in which Elias exerted control over those around him. He had left Virginia as soon as he was able, determined to build a life free from that oppressive influence. But he had never forgotten Margaret, and when he received her letters, he knew that she was in danger. He began to devise a plan to help her escape. It was risky, fraught with potential consequences, but he could not stand by and do nothing. He wrote back to her, embedding his own hidden messages in his letters, outlining a plan that would require careful timing, absolute secrecy, and a great deal of courage. The plan was simple in theory but difficult in execution. Thomas would arrange for Margaret to travel to a nearby town under the pretense of visiting a sick relative. Once there, she would meet a trusted friend of Thomas's, a woman who would provide her with new clothes, new identification, and enough money to travel west. Margaret would then board a train, disappear into the vastness of the American frontier, and begin a new life under a new name. It was a desperate plan, one that relied on 100 small things going right, but it was the only option they had. Margaret agreed. She spent weeks preparing, gathering the few possessions she could not bear to leave behind, memorizing the details of the plan, rehearsing the lies she would have to tell. And on a cool morning in late May 1903, she walked out of her father's house for what she hoped would be the last time. What happened next is difficult to piece together with certainty. The historical record is incomplete, fragmented, full of gaps and silences. But the historian was able to find a few crucial pieces of evidence that shed light on Margaret's fate. She found a newspaper article from June 1903, a brief notice reporting that a young woman matching Margaret's description had been seen boarding a train in a town about 50 miles from her father's estate. She found a letter in Thomas's papers, dated several months later, in which he mentioned receiving word that our friend had arrived safely and was beginning to build a new life. And she found, in the records of a small town in Oregon, a marriage certificate for a woman named Mary Grant, who had married a local schoolteacher in 1904. The description of Mary Grant matched Margaret Hargrove in every detail: her age, her physical appearance, even the faint scar on her left hand that Margaret had mentioned in one of her hidden messages. The historian could not be certain, but the evidence strongly suggested that Margaret had escaped, that she had successfully left her father's control behind and had built a new life for herself in the West. As for Elias Hargrove, the records show that he lived for another 15 years, dying in 1918. There is no indication that he ever knew what had become of his daughter. The official story, the one repeated in local newspapers and society columns, was that Margaret had died of an illness while visiting relatives. It was a convenient fiction, one that allowed Elias to maintain his reputation and avoid the scandal that would have resulted from admitting that his daughter had run away. But those who knew the truth, Thomas, the woman who had helped Margaret escape, a few trusted friends, knew that Margaret had not died. She had simply vanished, erased herself from the historical record, and in doing so, had reclaimed her life. The letter dated April 14, 1903, is now housed in a special collection at a university library, preserved under controlled conditions, accessible to researchers and the public. It has been digitized, reproduced, and studied extensively. It has become a symbol of the hidden histories that exist all around us, the stories of people whose voices were silenced, whose experiences were erased, whose lives were lived in the shadows. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experiences, many of which have been forgotten or deliberately obscured. And it challenges us to look more closely at the documents we encounter, to read not just the words on the surface but the silences, the gaps, the hidden messages that lie beneath. The story of Margaret and Thomas is a story of courage, of resistance, of the human capacity to endure and to hope even in the most difficult circumstances. It is a story that speaks to the ways in which power operates, the ways in which control is exerted and maintained, and the ways in which those who are oppressed find ways to resist, to communicate, to reclaim their agency. It is a story that resonates across time, that speaks to contemporary struggles for autonomy, for dignity, for the right to live free from violence and coercion. And it is a story that would have remained hidden forever if not for the careful, patient work of historians who refuse to accept the official narratives, who dig deeper, who listen for the voices that have been silenced. The letter is a reminder that history is not a fixed, unchanging thing. It is constantly being reinterpreted, constantly being revised as new evidence comes to light. The story of Margaret Hargrove was not part of the historical record until the letter was discovered. Her voice had been erased, her experiences forgotten. But now, more than a century later, her story is being told. Her words are being read. Her courage is being recognized. And in that recognition, there is a kind of justice, a restoration of memory, a refusal to let her suffering be forgotten. The historian who discovered the letter has spent years studying it, analyzing it, placing it in context. She has written extensively about the techniques of hidden writing, about the history of women's communication in the early 1900s, about the ways in which women found ways to resist the control exerted over them. She has given talks, led workshops, collaborated with other scholars to build a more complete picture of the lives of women like Margaret. And she has come to understand that the letter is not just a historical artifact. It is a call to action, a reminder that there are still voices being silenced, still stories being erased, still people living in situations of control and oppression. The work of uncovering hidden histories is never finished. It requires vigilance, patience, and a commitment to listening to those whose voices have been marginalized. The letter also raises important questions about the ethics of historical research. When we uncover the hidden stories of people like Margaret, we are not just recovering the past. We are also making choices about how to represent those stories, how to interpret them, how to share them with a wider audience. The historian who discovered the letter has been careful to treat Margaret's words with respect, to avoid sensationalizing her suffering, to place her story within a broader historical and social context. She has consulted with descendants of the Hargrove family, with community members, with other scholars to ensure that her interpretation is fair, accurate, and sensitive to the complexities of the past. She has also been mindful of the ways in which Margaret's story might be used or misused, the ways in which it might be appropriated for purposes that Margaret herself would not have endorsed. The work of historical interpretation is never neutral. It is always shaped by the perspectives, the values, the biases of those who undertake it. And it is always subject to revision, to critique, to ongoing debate. The letter is also a testament to the power of small acts of resistance. Margaret did not stage a dramatic rebellion. She did not publicly denounce her father or challenge the social norms of her time. She simply wrote hidden words in the margins of a letter, embedded secret messages in seemingly innocuous correspondence, and trusted that someone would understand. And yet, those small acts of resistance were enough. They allowed her to communicate, to maintain a sense of agency, to hold on to hope even in the darkest moments. They were the first steps in a process that eventually led to her escape, to her freedom, to the possibility of a new life. The letter reminds us that resistance does not always take the form of grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, almost invisible, but it is no less powerful for that. The story of the letter has also had a profound impact on the community where Margaret lived. When the letter was first publicized, there was resistance from some members of the Hargrove family, who felt that the historian was tarnishing the family's reputation, dredging up old scandals that were best left buried. But over time, attitudes began to shift. Younger members of the family, particularly women, began to see the letter as an important part of their family history, a reminder of the struggles that their ancestors faced and the courage they showed in the face of oppression. The local historical society organized an exhibition featuring the letter and other documents related to women's lives in the early 1900s. The exhibition was well attended, sparking conversations about gender, power, and the ways in which history is remembered and represented. Schools began to incorporate the letter into their curriculum, using it as a teaching tool to discuss issues of agency, resistance, and the importance of listening to marginalized voices. And gradually, the story of Margaret Hargrove became a source of pride rather than shame, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, people find ways to resist, to survive, to reclaim their lives. The letter has also inspired other researchers to look for similar documents, to search for hidden messages in archives and collections around the world. And they have found them. Letters with invisible ink, diaries with coded entries, photographs with hidden symbols. Each discovery adds to our understanding of the ways in which people have communicated in secret, the ways in which they have resisted control, the ways in which they have found ways to speak even when silence was imposed upon them. The historian who discovered the letter has often reflected on the moment when she first saw the hidden writing, the moment when the second narrative revealed itself. She describes it as a moment of profound connection, a feeling of reaching across time to touch the hand of someone who had lived more than a century earlier. She felt the weight of Margaret's trust, the responsibility of sharing her story in a way that honored her courage and her struggle. And she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to bring Margaret's voice out of the silence, to ensure that her story would not be forgotten. The letter is a reminder that history is not just about the powerful, the famous, the people whose names appear in textbooks and monuments. It is also about the ordinary people, the ones whose stories are not recorded in official documents, whose voices are not preserved in public speeches, whose lives are lived in the margins. It is about the women like Margaret, who wrote hidden words in secret, who risked everything for the chance to be heard, who refused to let their voices be silenced. And it is a reminder that we have a responsibility to listen, to seek out those hidden voices, to make space for them in our understanding of the past. The work of recovering hidden histories is ongoing. It requires dedication, patience, and a willingness to look beyond the surface, to question the official narratives, to listen for the silences and the gaps. It requires a commitment to justice, to ensuring that the stories of those who have been marginalized and oppressed are not forgotten. And it requires a recognition that history is not a static thing, but a living, breathing process of interpretation and reinterpretation, of memory and forgetting, of silencing and speaking. The letter dated April 14, 1903, is a small piece of paper, fragile and yellowed with age. But it contains within it a world of meaning, a story of courage and resistance, of control and escape, of silence and voice. It is a document that challenges us to look more closely, to read between the lines, to listen for the hidden messages that lie beneath the surface. And it is a reminder that even in the most oppressive circumstances, people find ways to resist, to communicate, to reclaim their agency. The story of Margaret and Thomas is a story that speaks across time, that resonates with contemporary struggles for freedom and dignity. It is a story that reminds us of the power of small acts of resistance, the importance of listening to marginalized voices, and the necessity of questioning the official narratives that shape our understanding of the past. It is a story that would have remained hidden forever if not for the careful, patient work of historians who refuse to accept the easy answers, who dig deeper, who listen for the voices that have been silenced. And it is a story that reminds us that history is not just something that happened in the past. It is something that we create, something that we interpret, something that we pass on to future generations. The choices we make about which stories to tell, which voices to amplify, which narratives to preserve, these are choices that shape our understanding of who we are and where we come from. The letter is a call to action, a reminder that there are still hidden stories waiting to be discovered, still voices waiting to be heard, still people living in situations of control and oppression. The work of uncovering hidden histories is never finished. It is a continuous process of listening, interpreting, and remembering. And it is a process that requires all of us to participate, to question, to dig deeper, to refuse to accept the surface narratives, and to insist that every voice matters, every story deserves to be told. As we reflect on the story of the letter, we are reminded that the past is not a distant, disconnected thing. It is intimately connected to the present, shaping our understanding of ourselves and our world. The struggles that Margaret faced, the struggle for autonomy, for the right to speak, for the freedom to live her own life, are struggles that continue today. The systems of control and oppression that she resisted are still present, albeit in different forms. And the work of resistance, of reclaiming voice, of insisting on dignity and agency, is work that continues. The letter is a bridge between past and present, a reminder that the voices of those who came before us still have something to teach us, still have something to say. And it is a reminder that we have a responsibility to listen, to honor those voices, to ensure that they are not forgotten. The story of Margaret Hargrove is a story of one woman's courage, but it is also a story about all of us, about the ways in which we resist, the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we hold on to hope even in the darkest moments. It is a story that reminds us that history is not just about kings and presidents, wars and treaties, but about the everyday struggles of ordinary people, the small acts of resistance that add up to something larger, the hidden voices that shape the world in ways we cannot always see. And it is a story that challenges us to look more closely at the world around us, to read between the lines, to listen for the hidden messages, and to never stop asking questions. The discovery of Margaret's letter opened a door that could never be closed again. It became a catalyst for a much broader investigation into the lives of women in early 20th century America, particularly those who lived under conditions of extreme control and isolation. The historian who had uncovered the hidden writing began to receive messages from people all over the country, descendants of families with similar stories, archivists who had noticed strange patterns in old correspondence, researchers who had always suspected that there was more to certain documents than met the eye. Each new contact brought with it the possibility of another hidden narrative, another voice waiting to be recovered from the silence of history. One particularly compelling case came from a woman in Massachusetts who had inherited a trunk full of her great-grandmother's belongings. Among the items was a series of letters dating from 1905 to 1910, all addressed to a man named Samuel. The letters were affectionate, chatty, filled with descriptions of daily life and news of mutual friends. But the woman who contacted the historian had noticed something odd. In several of the letters, certain words were underlined in pencil, seemingly at random, with no apparent pattern or purpose. She had assumed it was simply a quirk of her great-grandmother's writing style, but after hearing about Margaret's hidden messages, she began to wonder if there might be more to it. The historian asked the woman to send high-resolution scans of the letters, and she began to examine them closely. She listed every underlined word in order, writing them out in a single line. At first, the words seemed meaningless, a jumble of unrelated terms. But then she noticed something. If she took only the first letter of each underlined word, a message began to emerge. The letters spelled out short phrases. He watches me. Cannot leave. Help me, Samuel. Plan to escape. It was another hidden communication, another woman using whatever means she had at her disposal to send a secret message to someone she trusted. The historian was astounded. Margaret's letter had not been an isolated case. The practice of hiding messages in correspondence was more widespread than anyone had realized. It suggested a network of women who had developed their own methods of secret communication, who had shared techniques and strategies, who had found ways to resist the surveillance and control that defined their lives. The historian began to research the phenomenon more systematically, reaching out to archives and libraries across the country, asking if they had any correspondence from the early 1900s that showed signs of unusual markings, erasures, or other anomalies. The response was overwhelming. Within a few months, she had identified more than 30 examples of hidden writing in letters from that period, each one revealing a story of control, resistance, and the desperate need to communicate. Some of the hidden messages were written in invisible ink, made from lemon juice or other household substances that could only be read when the paper was heated. Others used codes and ciphers, with words or phrases that had specific meanings known only to the sender and recipient. Still others used the technique Margaret had employed, writing in the margins or between the lines in ink that was lighter or finer than the main text. Each method reflected the ingenuity and resourcefulness of women who had no other means of speaking freely, who had to find creative ways to evade the surveillance of fathers, husbands, or other male authority figures. The historian compiled her findings into a comprehensive study, detailing the various methods of hidden communication and analyzing the social and historical context in which they had developed. She argued that these letters were not just curiosities or isolated incidents, but evidence of a widespread culture of female resistance in the early 20th century. They showed that women were not passive victims of patriarchal control, but active agents who found ways to assert their autonomy, to maintain relationships, and to seek help when they needed it. The study was published to widespread acclaim, and it sparked a renewed interest in the history of women's communication and resistance. But the work of recovering hidden histories was not without its challenges. Some families were reluctant to have their ancestors' private correspondence made public, fearing that it would tarnish the family's reputation or expose painful secrets that had been carefully buried for generations. Others questioned the ethics of reading and publishing letters that had been intended to remain private, arguing that the historian was violating the privacy and dignity of the women who had written them. The historian took these concerns seriously. She recognized that the work she was doing was not just an academic exercise, but a deeply personal and political act. She was making choices about which stories to tell, which voices to amplify, and how to represent the lives of women who could no longer speak for themselves. She developed a set of ethical guidelines for her work, consulting with descendants whenever possible, respecting requests for anonymity, and always contextualizing the letters within a broader historical and social framework. She also made a commitment to share her findings not just with other scholars, but with the general public, making the letters accessible through online archives, public exhibitions, and educational programs. She believed that these stories had the power to change the way people understood history, to challenge the dominant narratives that had erased or marginalized women's experiences, and to inspire contemporary movements for gender justice and equality. One of the most powerful aspects of the letters was the way they revealed the emotional and psychological toll of living under constant surveillance and control. Margaret's hidden writing, and the writings of other women like her, were not just factual accounts of their circumstances. They were expressions of fear, anger, desperation, and hope. They showed the ways in which control was not just about physical restriction, but about the erosion of selfhood, the constant pressure to conform, to be silent, to accept the role that had been assigned. Many of the letters contained passages that were heartbreaking in their honesty. Women wrote about feeling invisible, about losing their sense of identity, about the ways in which their thoughts and feelings were dismissed or denied. They wrote about the loneliness of living in a house full of people who did not see them, did not hear them, did not recognize their humanity. And they wrote about the small acts of resistance that allowed them to maintain some sense of self, reading forbidden books, writing in secret journals, forming clandestine friendships, planning escapes that might never come to fruition. These letters were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the ways in which people find ways to endure even in the most oppressive circumstances. They were also a reminder that the history of oppression is not just a history of suffering, but a history of resistance, of creativity, of the refusal to be silenced. The historian also began to explore the question of what had happened to the women who had written these hidden messages.